Hello everyone and welcome to another video with me, 320 SimPilot, and today we're taking a look at a question I get asked all the time, which is when and why do we use flap 3 in the A320? I am a real-world Airbus pilot, so in this video today I'm just going to talk you through what we choose flap 3 for in real life, what some of the differences are, and how we apply that when using flap 3. We'll cover two parts of the flight really, obviously, the takeoff and landing, which is when we're going to use the flaps. And for those of you wondering what on earth flap 3 is, it's just one of the flap settings we have in the aircraft. It's an intermediate setting, so it's not flaps up and it's not flaps full. It's in its own category, and it simply just refers to one position. In Boeing aircraft, this would be, or a lot of other aircraft actually, this would be given an angle, but we don't do that in the A320. It's simplified, so it's just called flap 3. It's obviously a lot more than 3 degrees, but what it is it's a setting for both the slats and flaps actually, which travel out to a certain position. So as you can see here, the trailing edge flaps are extended quite a lot, and the slats also extended quite a lot as well. It's of note, however, that even though this is usable as a takeoff and a landing flap, it doesn't even look that severe, and when you look at it on the wing, it's not massively distinguishable from flap 2, and we'll talk about why in just a moment. We're going to start off the video here in Gibraltar using the latest experimental version of the fly-by-wire A32NX mod, and of course, just before we get started, I'd like to say that we are of course going to be talking about things that we do in the real world, but this is not for any real world use, just to give some extra context on your home simulations. Before we do get started, I'd just like to remind you of our partnership with Apex Gaming PCs, where we have a line of custom 320 SimPilot PCs that you can also customize yourself on the website. If you do buy one, you'll be supporting the channel, and you can get a 5% discount with the code 320 SimPilot. So let's discuss what we're actually talking about here. The slats and flaps are obviously a key part of any aircraft. They are used to increase the lift off of the wing and also allow us to fly slower and still produce lift on the wing. They do slightly different things each. So what the slats do is let us slow down the airplane by raising the angle of attack. So you can fly the airplane through the air with the nose higher compared to the airflow. So the slats are very good at that. But what they don't really do is add any lift to the wing. They just let you fly at a higher angle of attack with the same wing, with the same amount of lift. So they let you fly slower by letting you raise the nose more to fly level, if that makes sense. It's a very, very simplified take on it, I'm sure. The flaps provide more lift at the same airspeed. So with slats, we can fly slower, but that does involve raising the nose more, but they prevent the wing from stalling as we do that to a certain extent. The flaps actually provide lift, so they come out the back of the wing and they provide more lift. So slats are along the leading edge, they're the bits you can see on the front of the wing, and the flaps are on the trailing edge, and they will provide more lift for a given airspeed, but they also provide a lot of drag, whereas slats don't. And that's going to be important later on when we're talking about using flap 3. So in the Airbus, we have several settings. We have 0, 1, 2, 3 and full. Now, as you can see, we're currently set to 3. This is a simplified name. In lots of aircraft, they'd give you the actual angles, like a Boeing would say 0 degrees, 2 degrees, 5 degrees, 15 degrees. Airbus simplified it into 0 to full. Now, we currently have them set to 3. As you can see, if I move the lever to 2, we get a change, and we see that now it says 2, and if I move it to 1, we get another change, and obviously up. So something to note, and if we just, I'll just jump outside. So something to note is that there are obviously different flap and slat positions, but we only control one thing. We control the overall position. So we call it flaps 1, 2, 3 full, but it does involve the slats as well. So from now on, we'll just forget about that. Another thing to note as a side of that is that position 2, which we have here, the slats, that's what the S is for, don't move. So 2 and 3 have the same slat position. I can give you the angles if you're interested. So it's actually 22 degrees of slats in both position 3 and 2. If we go to full, we get more slats and more flaps. So there we go. So used for both takeoff and landing, we can use the slats and flaps to get more lift and allow the airplane to have a higher angle of attack safely without stalling the wing. They both come with a downside, which is they provide drag, which is why we don't leave them out all flight, and they also limit our maximum speed. So let's show you, we'll stick at flap 3 for now, and finally I will just point out that the difference in flap angle between 2 and 3 is quite small. So flap 2 is 15 degrees of flap. Flap 3 is 20 degrees, so only 5 degrees difference. But if we go to flap full, it's 40. So flap full is double the angle of flap 3. So the difference between flap 2 and 3 very small. It's you can feel it as well flying. It hardly makes a difference. Flap 2 is a big change, and flap full is a big change. But there we go. Okay. So we're going to talk about takeoff first, which is why we're here in Gibraltar. So why might we use flap 3 for takeoff? Well, the first and most obvious one that I'm sure those of you who have been simming for a while will be screaming at your monitors is the short runway problem. So as you can guess, if we have a short runway, as we do at Gibraltar, one of the most famously short ones, it is useful to be able to take off in a short distance. So we have a takeoff distance here of just 1680 meters on runway, or which runway on? We're on 27, so we have 1628 meters, even less. Now, that is not a lot for an Airbus, especially one that's heavily loaded, and there's other performance implications, such as being hot and so on. But there we go. So more flaps means we can get off the ground quicker because we're generating more lift off of that wing. And you think, well, that's great, so we'd always want to use flap 3 for takeoff. But it comes with a downside, which, as we discussed, is the drag. Obviously, if we look on the outside of the airplane, by having all of this extra bits hanging out, the airplane has more aerodynamic drag. It also produces more drag from the lift because you're generating more lift off of the wing. So there's two problems there. So if we take off with these, it's great for getting off the ground quicker, but the downside is going to be that once we're in the air, and we don't really need that anymore because the airplane's flying already, we have all this drag from these flaps, and we can't just raise them low to the ground because it's going to change the aerodynamics, it's going to reduce the lift all of a sudden. So it has an implication on our ability to climb once we get off the end of the runway. Now here, it's not too bad. There are some obstacles over there, but they're quite a way away. So our focus here is getting off the ground in as short as distance as possible. So we're going to use flap 3. You probably have to in Gibraltar, just the runway length would just dictate it unless you're incredibly light with a strong headwind or something like that. But there we go. So that's the primary purpose for using flap 3 on takeoff. It's just excellent for the ground distance. Now, I had mentioned the obstacles. In this case, they're a way away, but if the obstacles were quite close in, it could be advantageous to go flap 3 as well, because it's going to give us the shortest distance to climb immediately. So if there was a crane or something near the end of the runway, flap 3 will help us because we'll pass that threshold at a higher distance. But this is starting to get complicated because lots of things could change that, such as the wind and so on. So there could be occasions where flap 1 or 2 are better for that. Because, of course, the advantage of using less flap is there's less drag, so we can accelerate down the runway, use more runway roll, but then once we're in the air, there's less drag, and we climb away really well with that extra speed. So for far out obstacles, then using less flap is better. We can climb away quicker. But short runways, flap 3 would make a lot of sense, as you'd probably have guessed. Another one would be high weight. So it could be that you're in quite a long runway, but your aeroplane is very heavy or it's very hot, or a high altitude airport. So these are all things that lower the performance. They typically, the theme of them is thinning of the air. So if you have very thin air, and I say that in the loosest sense, you'd never notice as a person, mainly unless you're up in the mountains or something. But if you think about it, if you go up into the mountains, the air's thinner, it's harder to breathe and get the oxygen in, and we have the problem where there's less density to the air, and we rely on that air for the airplane to fly. So if we are up in high altitude places where there's low density, then we might need more flap just to get the airplane safely away from the ground, even if the runway's pretty long. And you might also find that with hot places, because the hotter the air, the less dense it is as well. So these are bad for the performance of the airplane and also the engines. So all reasons we might choose to use flap 3. But this is very simplified. There are reasons where still flap 1 will work better even in those circumstances. Another thing that pilots talk about with flap 3 is the IFATO case. Now, if you haven't seen my video, I do have one talking about IFATOs. What I'm referring to there is an engine failure at takeoff or after takeoff. So this is an engine failure at the worst possible moment where you can no longer stop on the runway and you have to go flying. So you're going to have an engine failure and you're still going to rotate the airplane from the ground into the air. It's a tricky maneuver that pilots spend a lot of time training. So it's perfectly safe, and it's something that we do every sim check, and we have to prove we can do just to keep our license. But that is noticeably different to handle in the Airbus with flap 3. The reason is you've got more drag. So once again, the airplane has less spare performance. When you have one engine and more flap out, you've got more drag on the airplane. So less room in terms of performance, and you have to really get it sorted and squared away very carefully. Again, I recommend my video on that if you'd like to learn more about engine failures after takeoff. But so flap 1 would be the preferred case for those because there's less drag. The airplane has got more performance once it's in the air. And it doesn't matter that it takes longer to get off the runway in that case, because if you're still on the runway and you can stop, you still have that option. So the last thing we need to talk about for takeoffs for now, and I'm sure I've missed other things, and there'll be people watching this who have more ideas, and I no doubt I've missed some things, but something that does come up is the windiness. So if it's really strong winds or expecting wind shear on takeoff, would you use flap 3? And it's interesting, there is a school of thought that says no, you shouldn't. And why is that? Well, we talked earlier that these produce drag and they sit out in the airflow, but there is another problem with them, which is they have limiting speeds. So we have to retract them, not just because mainly because we wouldn't want them out because they would burn extra fuel because of the extra drag, but as a result of that, they also have speed limits. So we can't fly through the air very quickly with them out, or they will get damaged. So if you're trying to fly a quick descent, you can't just put all the flaps out because the speed will most likely damage them. They're not designed for it. The wing is best off when they're all retracted. So there we go. We have the speed limits. They're actually helpfully written on this little placard. So it's VFE, which stands for velocity with flaps extended. So that's what these V speeds all are, and this is what VFE is. So with flaps 1 out, it's at 230 knots. Flap 1 plus F, and there is a difference, but that's for another video. It's 215. Flap 2, 200. Flap 3, 185. So if we took off on the ground, when you put the lever to 1, you get 1 plus F. In air, you'd get just 1. So we get 215 knots because we've got slats and flaps out. So if we take off and we rotate at a typical flap 1 speed, and I'm just going to the performance page, we'll put flap 1 in there. We won't do any flexing, we'll do toga, and we can just see. Now I know these speeds aren't perfectly accurate, but it is a bit of a database. There we go. So we've got a V1 and a VR, of 132, and we'll be climbing away just above 136. So the airplane on 2 engines will target 10 knots above that, so 146. So we're climbing away 146 knots. Flap 1 would give us a lot of spare room, 90 knots before we would risk overspeeding. So if we hit wind shear or we're in very rough air, we would have you'd never hit wind shear that bad that you could then overspeed the flaps, which is just one less thing to think about. As pilots, you get the red bar, and we don't like flying near the red bar, so that can provide a distraction anyway. So flap 1 does have its advantages. Also, by being faster, you can find that it can cut through the air a little better, but that's very subjective, and there are arguments the other way. But there we go. So if we were to be flap 3, let's put that in. Speed will go down. Oh. Surprised it's complaining already for that, but there we go. Let's recalculate the speeds. So as you can see, they're lower because we get more lift, so we don't need to go as fast. 127. But the downside here is our limiting speed is 185. So now we've reduced that margin. Now this isn't the heaviest takeoff ever. You could be heavier, but either way, we're targeting 127, so 137, so about 140 knots. We've got about 45 knots spare. So if you take off and you end up fast on the takeoff and then you hit some wind shear, you've got more of a chance of busting the flaps. But that's not a rule. This idea of using less flaps on windy days is pretty much a pilot's decision. It is not written down anywhere. For landing, it's a slightly different story, so we'll talk about that. Okay, so now we're going to look at landing and approaches using flap 3 and why we might do that over flap full. So the first one we're going to talk about is the runway length. So if we have a really short runway, on takeoff we're going to use flap 3 because it gives us more lift than flap 2 or flap 1. On landing, flap 3, of course, compared to flap full, gives us less lift, so therefore we have to approach at a higher speed, and the result of that is we need more runway to roll out. So flap 3 would not be used on short runways. It is, however, quite a nice setting, or some pilots like to use it when there is a very long runway. So if you're landing somewhere with a 3 kilometer, 4 kilometer runway, and you just like flap 3, then you might choose to do it. But there is a second advantage to using flap 3 in those situations. We talked earlier about the difference in degrees. So a flap 3 landing would be with a flap setting of approximately 20 degrees, whereas a flap full is 40 degrees. So that's double the flap, which means, of course, the engines on approach will have to spool up to counteract that drag. So you burn more fuel doing a flap full approach compared to a flap 3, which also makes more noise down below and more pollution. So there is a noticeable advantage to flap 3 in those situations, in that it's quieter, so it's quieter for people living below, and it burns less fuel, so it's cheaper for the airline, and it's better for the environment. The downside of that is you'll use more runway, so you need to coordinate that with where you want to actually vacate the runway. There's no point doing a flap 3 if you're planning to vacate quite quickly, or you need to, for example, at busy airports where they might not want you to hang out on the runway for too long. They might want you to get off quickly if you're in a short-haul aircraft like the Airbus. Now, there's a lot of factors that go into that sort of decision making, and I'm sure I'm going to miss loads today. But in general, a shorter runway, you can't use flap 3, you'll use flap 4. Longer runways, it's an option. But I will say this, there's a lot of pilots who don't like flap 3 in the A320, and the reason is it handles quite differently. The nose will be higher on approach. Now, obviously, we aren't actually configured here. This is on the run into Salzburg, which we'll talk about in just a second why we're here. But yeah, so on a flap 3 approach, the nose will be higher, and it's a bit of a different picture out the window, and the airplane doesn't control the speed as well because you've got less drag and the engines are slightly lower RPM, so they're less responsive, so it can wash around on the speed, be a bit wallowy by comparison. Now in 321s and 319s, that's less noticeable than in the 320, I would say, but that is a subjective thing, that's not a rule. So flap 3 is more efficient on approach, and some people like landing like that. The advantage that the pilots will who prefer it often say is that there's less flare to do because you've already got quite a high nose attitude, so you don't have to change that by much. You're flying through the air a bit quicker, the plane's a little bit more responsive in that sense. So that is a common theme. There is another reason to use flap 3 on an approach, and that is if wind shear is expected. This is a known procedure, and what we're talking about with wind shear is major changes to the wind speed and direction over a distance or a height change. So as we descend towards the runway, maybe we expect a 20-knot headwind to become a light tailwind. That would be wind shear. Even if it's not particularly rough or it doesn't sound extreme, it's a change, and that change can cause problems for the aircraft. So to counteract that, we can go flap 3 on approach, which means there's less drag on the aeroplane, and therefore if we enter a wind shear, our requirements are that we will go to toga power and follow the SRS, so i.e. toga power and climb away, and do not change the configuration. We're not allowed to change the configuration in wind shear, and by configuration I mean gear or flaps, and we don't change those in wind shear because whilst they're moving they can change the lift or drag of the aeroplane, which might be not in the way we want. So if you had the gear down on approach and then you enter a wind shear, so you add full power and try and climb away, if you then raise the gear, which you'd think would make sense because that's removing drag, but whilst the gear is moving it actually creates more drag because on the outside of the airplane all those little doors open up and the gear comes up into it, and that creates more holes and more drag for a short period of time, which could be the critical moment. So we do not change the configuration when escaping wind shear. The result is if we're already in flap 3 on approach and we enter wind shear, that is safer because we can then leave the flaps as they are and have not as much drag. As we said earlier, almost double the degree of flap when we go flap full, so quite a big difference in drag there. So it has its advantage in that sense. However, in turbulence, the aeroplane does handle, I think, nicer with flap full out and the engine spooled up at a higher percentage. I think it's easy to control the speed, and it handles a little bit more like a conventional aircraft, whereas in flap 3 some people prefer it and they might absolutely be fine, but in general in turbulence alone I would find flap full is my personal preference, but that is a very subjective thing. That's not written, well there is an argument that it is written, but anyway it's pilot's choice. So last reason to talk about flap 3 on approach and the reason we're here in Salzburg. Now this is a rare scenario, but this is a reason that we end up using flap 3 on some approaches, and that is the go around performance. So this is the ILS that we are, I wonder if I can find this, there we go. So we're about to fly this ILS into Salzburg on runway 15. Now this is a unique approach, it's got special procedures, so this is very rare, but there are airports and places where if you are trying to go around flap full, you can find yourself with too much drag out. So how is that possible? Well, a go around on a normal procedure has to account for the fact that your engine could have failed. We're flying multi-engine aircraft, and remember, safety is the priority for aviation and especially commercial aviation. So we have to plan for the fact that, say we're coming down the ILS and an engine fails, or we have to go around for another reason and then an engine fails. We need to be able to go around on just one engine and fly the go around procedure safely. There's no point having it where you don't have the performance to do that. So if we make the approach flap full, when we go around, you might remember from my go around videos, we would move the flaps in a stage, so you go from full to 3. So you'd fly the go around maneuver with flap 3 out, and you wouldn't change that until you were up at your platform altitude, so quite a time. So you'd end up flying this turn and near to this terrain with flap 3 out on single engine. And as we said earlier on takeoff, that is a lot of drag, so we don't actually like that. So if we fly the approach in flap 3, then when we go around, we'll move them from 3 to 2. And then we're doing this go around with just 2 stages of flap instead of 3. Now, we said earlier that there's not actually that much difference. It's only between 15 degrees and 20 degrees, so it's 5 degrees. But either way, it's better performance. So that is another reason, again, very rare. It's very specific airports, usually with their own performance procedures and special training. But anyway, it is sometimes the case that we would use flap 3 for landing, because if we have to go around, we need to be flap 3 to enable us to have the climb performance in the go around if an engine fails. So you can see here, missed approach climb gradient minimum 5% for this ILS. So it's slightly different. Now it is possible, just for those of you interested in Salzburg, it is possible that you may not be able to make that. So they actually provide some other charts. So here we have some other charts. So missed approach climb gradient just 4%, and you can even get out to 2.5. But you'll notice that these have to go around from earlier on in the approach, so they've got worse minima. So anyway, that is a total tangent on what we were talking about. So these are some reasons that flap 3 might be used for approach, depending on the situation. By the way, as I should have done at the start, really, you can just about see Salzburg. There's a Salzburg runway, and here's all that terrain around it. So we don't actually climb over that terrain on the go around here. You have to actually turn within it. So there's a few factors at play as to why this approach is different. Something I should point out is that if you're doing a flap 3, you need to do 2 things different. You need to select flap 3 in the MCDU, which will change the V approach. So you can see there it's 125, and if you make flap 3 135, I think that's, I'm not sure the real aircraft does that much difference, but anyway. And also on the overhead, you need to change the GPWS landing flap to 3. So you press on, and that will give you the ECAM memo saying GPWS flap 3. The reason is, this is for the aeroplane to know, but the GPWS system is slightly separate, so we need it to be aware, so it doesn't shout at us and say too low flap, because it would think we're not at landing flap. So anyway, we tell that, and there we go, GPWS flap 3. So we're at flap 2 now, and you'll see that flap 2, in approach phase activated in the MCDU, the airplane does decelerate to a suitable speed. The F-speed is actually almost at VAP. And then if we put flap 3 out, there it goes, hardly anything changes, and it will just slow down below the green F to the magenta bug for flap 3. So there you go. And that is the picture now. So you'll see that we have a pitch angle of 5 degrees, quite common. The landing limit on a 320 is 10 degrees, so we have all the way up to 10 degrees on landing. But if there's much turbulence, that can actually make it quite difficult to keep it in a sensible range, but even so, it's not too bad. Aircraft like the Q400 are much worse for their tail strike performance. But there we go. So slightly higher nose attitude on approach, slightly faster speeds, and that's it. But it's totally acceptable and quite normal to fly and land the aircraft like this. Beautiful, beautiful scenery here in Salzburg. Very impressed with that, as ever, from Microsoft Flight Simulator. As a side note, let's just put out flap full and see the difference. If I go to config 4, I think we just got time. There you go, there's the difference. And then we go to flap full. And it slows down. And you'll see the nose, it's probably sitting around 2.5 to 5 as a maximum, somewhere around there. A little bit lower, a little bit lower. Right, let's go back to where we were. You can indeed auto-land flap 3 as well. So that is the magic of the Airbus. Very capable. It can land flap 3 on the automatics. Very clever stuff.
400. 100 above. 300. Minimum 200. 100. 50, 40, 30, 20, 10. Retard.
So that's all for today's video. Thank you very much for watching. I hope it's been useful for you. This is a big topic really, and a lot of different factors go into it, so I'm sure there'll be more questions. Do feel free to put those in the comment or come to a live stream where I answer these sorts of questions live. There'll be plenty more videos like this and guides on the Airbus, as well as more live streams in the Airbus and other aircraft, so do please subscribe if you'd like to see more of those. Otherwise, we'll see you again in another video or live stream soon. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.